What do you do when words don't work? This is a question that came up in the early Sangha that the Buddha had to deal with on several occasions. And we'll look at these sort of extreme cases in today's video coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So many of us will know that the Dharma of early Buddhism, the teaching that the Buddha gave, was really relentlessly pacifist. That is to say, there were really no examples of a time when the Buddha would have recommended injuring somebody or being violent in some way. And this kind of relentless pacifism is perhaps best illustrated by one particular sutta from the early tradition, in which the Buddha discusses how monastics should deal with being berated by, let's say, lay people who disagreed with them, or even how they might deal with certain kinds of physical assault, although those were less common. And the Buddha recommended an approach of universal kindness, so that even, the Buddha said, even under the situation that you were being really roughly handled, even killed by, as he describes it, nasty bandits, with a two-handled saw, he says, taken to pieces, he says even under those situations you should have a mind of loving kindness towards them. However, you may then ask yourself, what should we do when being berated? What should we do when being assaulted by others, and verbally or physically? Should we do nothing? And this seems not correct to us. It doesn't seem very satisfying or realistic just to be completely passive. And indeed, the Buddha wasn't arguing for pacifism in that sense, or passivism, being passive in that sense. The Buddha recommended a number, or at least, if not objectively recommended them, there were a number of different tactics that come across in the early texts that could be used. First, the Buddha was very willing to argue with people who disagreed with him. He did not, shall we say, keep his own counsel when somebody berated him or disagreed with him. He argued back. He was willing to argue particularly with people who were non-Buddhist, who came from other belief systems and wanted to come to him and ask him some questions that they felt the Buddha was wrong about. And the Buddha had no problem arguing with them, and arguing strenuously indeed. Also, many of us may know that the Buddha was quite open at berating his own monastics if he felt that they didn't understand the Dharma properly. So he would make a point of arguing with them or pointing them out as being incorrect, although we have to keep in mind that this is what the Buddha says is that this kind of strategy of arguing with somebody or of berating somebody if they've gotten something incorrect has to be done at the right time and place. It's not simply any time you should do this, but you should pick a time at which your action is going to have the most beneficial kinds of results. And also, you should do it with a mind of kindness, rather than with a mind filled with anger. This is sort of the bedrock of this kind of approach. But these issues of arguing with monastics who were incorrect, or with non-Buddhists who were coming with arguments towards the Buddha, these are pretty well known. I've discussed them a number of times in prior videos. It's also important to keep in mind that the Buddha did say that we should not simply pass over in silence when somebody was, let's say, being assaulted verbally and so on. I've discussed that as well, and we'll get to that at the end of the video. But more importantly, we have to look at cases where that wasn't enough, where simply arguing, simply using words didn't seem to solve the problem. And there's a paper by Andrew Huxley, which I'll refer to somewhat. I'll put a link to the paper in the show notes below. I'm not sure if there's a link, but in any event, I'll tell you the paper in the show notes below. You can try and find it if you want, where Huxley discusses some issues that come up with particularly recalcitrant monastics. That is to say, that when a monastic was not sort of following along with the Sangha, was not following what eventually became the monastic rules of the Sangha, there was really only a limited amount that the Sangha could do. The most stringent punishment that the Sangha could mete out to somebody was expulsion. Was basically to strip them of their monastic order or title, that they could no longer call themselves monastics. However, we might wonder what might happen if a monastic refused to go along with the decision of the Sangha in these kinds of cases. There's first the potential that the monastic might simply hang around the Sangha. There's another possibility, which Huxley describes, that isn't really discussed in the early text, but we might at least keep in mind, that a monastic might go to a different Sangha. That is to say, these Sanghas, certainly at the time of the Buddha's day and for centuries thereafter, were spread out at quite large distances from each other in India and the surrounding area. And so if a monastic was, let's say, kicked out of one place, it is at least theoretically possible that they might have gone to a different Sangha and not told them that he'd been kicked out, and simply re-enrolled, so to speak, or even just claimed to still be a monastic. That is to say, he wouldn't even have needed to start at the beginning. He might just say, I'm a monastic from this other place. And since they wouldn't have known better, somebody could potentially continue on, even if they had been supposedly kicked out. So there's a number of different issues here to deal with, again, monastics that sort of failed to go along with the rules. Now there's a famous story in the early suttas where the Buddha, now I should say, as a background, the Buddha would generally recite the monastic rules, the particular sort of core of those rules called the Patimokkha. He would recite these rules every so often in front of the monastics. And they would sort of recite them together. He would lead the recitation. They would do this regularly. Indeed, I understand they still do this kind of thing regularly in Theravada monasteries to this day. That is, that they recite the rules so that they're all on the same page with them. This is one of the ways to keep the rules in mind, so that you don't forget them. But in this particular day, the Buddha was offered the chance to do this, to recite the rules, and didn't. And he refused to recite the rules several times, and eventually the monastics had to ask him, so why aren't we reciting the rules? We're supposed to be doing this now. And the Buddha said that he would not recite the rules as long as there was someone within the Sangha, this monastic group, who was in violation of them, who was not a true monastic. And I think the idea being here that the Buddha felt that it was improper to be reciting rules such as these in front of people who he believed, or at least one person he believed, was not taking them seriously. What's the point of going through a recitation if there are people who aren't listening, who were literally not taking the rules seriously? Now, it's not entirely clear what this monastic had done. It's not clear whether this monastic had been, in fact, censured and perhaps even told to leave and hadn't. None of this is made clear in the sutta. The only thing that's made clear is that there is some monastic who is in violation. But given the way the sutta is presented, I think we have to assume that this was the case, that this particular monastic had done some particularly stringent violation, that this monastic had been told, and perhaps even had been told to leave, but simply had not complied. He simply was just there. He was there even though he wasn't supposed to be. I say we should assume this because if this weren't the case, then you would think that the Buddha would simply tell the monastics to undertake a a rule violation kind of action against this monk before all this would have come down. So it's also possible that this particular instance happened before these rules were formulated, because these rules were formulated over a long number of years, at least so it seems from the evidence we have. So it's also possible that the rules really weren't in a final state at the time that this particular sutta was composed. At any event, the point is that the Buddha said he was not going to recite these rules, at least the rules that he had to recite. In other words, we're assuming there might be other rules that hadn't been formulated yet, but in any event, he wouldn't do this as long as there was this person in attendance. And so one of his right-hand disciples, Moggallana, becomes, in Huxley's words, the sort of Buddhist bouncer. He goes over to the monastic in question. He supposedly is able to tell which of the monastic is through some kind of insight. Presumably everybody might have known who it was. But in any event, he goes over to this monastic. He asks the monastic to leave. The monastic doesn't leave. He stays there. He asks a second time. And he asks a third time. And usually in these early suttas, once you ask something 3 times, as it were, things change. You're allowed to do something 3 times, and then, then the whole process sort of moves on to the next stage. And so, given that this monastic has been asked, he hasn't done anything, he hasn't left, he's still sitting there, Moggallana, it says, picks him up by his arm, marches him out the front door, the gates of the Sangha. Then when he throws him out, he closes the doors behind him and bars the door. Then Moggallana comes back to the Sangha, and they're able to continue with the rule recitation. Now, there are several interesting bits of information we can glean from this early sutta passage. First of all, did we really know that the Sangha, or at least some Sanghas anyhow, had walls around them, had doors that could be barred? This is an interesting kind of thing. If Sanghas were of any size, they certainly couldn't have been held in a house or in a small structure, so it must have been a kind of compound that allowed somebody like Moggallana to bar the door behind somebody and not allow them in. We might wonder what would have been the case if the Sangha were simply outside in a forest or a field as usually is described. You wouldn't have been able to do this. You wouldn't have been able to throw somebody out and then bar the door behind them. We also have to take consideration of the fact that this is a physical interaction. We're not simply arguing with somebody, because arguments, words haven't worked. You've told the person to leave. You've told the person that they're not really welcome there anymore, that they aren't welcome as a monastic. But if they don't follow suit, then you have to literally pick them up and move them somewhere else, which takes physical force, even if it's not really violence, you're not hurting them. But you have to wonder what would happen under certain circumstances like this. Now, there are a couple of other similar kinds of examples from the Vinaya. Now, the Vinaya is the large corpus of early texts that deal with the monastic rules. The Patimokkha that the Buddha recited is a small portion of this. The Vinaya was constructed over a number of decades, perhaps even centuries. It seems to be a somewhat later group of texts than the suttas themselves. One of the reasons we say that is that, to my knowledge, the Vinaya is, there's not a lot of overlap between the Vinayas of different Buddhist schools. So my understanding, not having looked at this in much detail, but is that there isn't really a large core of material in the Vinayas that you can say is common to all Buddhist schools, in the same way that you can say that about the suttas. In the suttas, you have this large common basket of information, although it's organized in different ways and there are certain differences, but in general you have this commonality in the suttas. You have much less of that in the Vinaya. So I'm not, the 2 stories I'm going to tell here are in the Theravada, the Pali Vinaya. I'm not sure that they're in other recensions of this. It would be interesting to know, and if you happen to know whether they are or aren't, put it in the show notes below. I'd be interested to know, and I'm sure everybody else would as well. So in any event, in the first of these Vinaya stories, it talks about a couple of monks named Assaji and Punabasu, who are off at a place called Kitagiri, which is quite apparently far from where the Buddha and his Sangha are residing. And it seems that Assaji and Punabasu are not really comporting themselves as monastics. There's a whole bunch of description about things that they're doing, but basically what it amounts to is that they seem to be sort of acting as lay people rather than monastics. They're not really upholding the monastic rule in the way that they should be. They're interacting much too much with the lay people, they're behaving as lay people. And so presumably the Buddha hears about this over a period of time because it seems to have gone on, and finally decides, look, we just need to kick these people out of the Sangha. They're no longer really monastics. So what the Buddha does is he tells his two right-hand disciples, that would be Moggallana and Sariputta, to go to Kitagiri and tell Assaji and Punabasu that they've been ejected from the Sangha, that they're no longer monastics. And what's interesting is what happens when the Buddha tells his two disciples to do this. Sariputta says to the Buddha, he says, "Venerable Sir, how can we do a formal procedure to banish these monks from Kitagiri? They are temperamental and harsh." And the Buddha responds, "Well, take many monks." That is, take many monks along with you to do this kind of operation. And there's a similar kind of story told after the Buddha's passing. After the Buddha's passing, or I should say, just before the Buddha died, the Buddha gave a number of final instructions to his disciples, and in particular to Ananda, who was his close attendant during much of his life. And one of these final instructions was to eject one monastic named Channa from the order. I'm not exactly clear on what Channa had done, but in any event, what he had done was bad enough that the Buddha thought, look, I haven't done it yet, but once I'm past, please just no longer interact with him. It wasn't literally telling him to leave the order, but it was the equivalent, which was that you should never talk to Channa and you should not instruct him, which amounts to the same thing, basically. And so what Ananda does after the Buddha's passing is he goes to the other elders, elder monastics, and discusses this subject with them. And he tells them that about what the Buddha had said about Channa, and the elders say, well, what you should do is to go to Channa and tell him that he has been basically ejected from the order, that we're not supposed to talk with him anymore. And so the elders say, well then, Reverend Ananda, enjoin the higher penalty on the monk Channa. Ananda responds, but how can I, honored sirs, enjoin the higher penalty on the monk Channa? That monk is fierce and rough. And the elders respond, well then, Reverend Ananda, go along together with many monks. So it's said that Ananda went to Channa with 500 monks. Now, these kinds of round numbers that we read in the early suttas are not really meant to be taken perfectly seriously. Numbers like 500 are generally meant to mean a large number. So, more than 2 or 3, let's say. So he went with a large number of monks to Channa to eject him from the order. Now, fortunately, in this case, it said in the Vinaya that Channa, when he heard about this, he was extremely contrite and sad, and indeed was, because of this, or through this, was able to attain awakening. And so, having attained this state of enlightenment or awakening, the rule against him was no longer valid. I mean, if he's an awakened being, then he's not there. There's no longer any problem with him. So in fact, they didn't have to engage this rule, but nevertheless, we see the kind of strategy that was taken given the possibilities. Now, I think both of these cases that we read about in the Vinaya, of Assaji and Punabasu on the one hand and Channa on the other, they raise the possibility of physical intercession, that is to say, the potential of violence. That is, why do you take large groups of monastics along with you? Both of these cases, the problem was that the monastics that they had to deal with were rough or fierce or difficult to handle, perhaps quick to anger, maybe even physically intimidating. And so the response is, take a large number of monks. Why? Well, presumably because if there were a problem, you had, arms, you had strength behind you. That is to say, literal arms. You had, lots and lots of people who were able to fight on your behalf. Now, of course, this is never spelled out in the suttas. There's never a discussion about recommending violence or recommending anything like that, but you have to wonder, what's the reason to bring large groups with you? The reason is, at least presumably, partly anyhow, intimidation. Now, one could also argue that you do this in order to allay the possibility of violence. That is, if you have a large group with you, it makes it less likely that one or two recalcitrant monks are going to feel like they can fight their way out of the situation, like they can become a problem, because they're going to see that any attempt on their part to fight or to become violent would not be successful, would be in fact harmful to them. Now there's one last way to, we might say, punish either recalcitrant monks or, in this circumstance, a circumstance I'm going to discuss, to punish an entire recalcitrant sangha, which is something even of a higher order. It's discussed in the Pali Vinaya, which again, I'm not exactly sure to what extent there are parallels in other examples, but in any event, in the Pali Vinaya it's discussed about how a sangha of monks at Kosambi were particularly quarrelsome and difficult. That is, they couldn't get along with each other. There were constant arguments breaking out. Even to the extent of physical altercations between the monks in Kosambi. Presumably they couldn't agree on some aspect of either the Dharma or the Vinaya, that is to say, the monastic rules. There was something that was, it's not made clear what the problem was, but there was something that was getting them to fight with each other. And there was no way that they could find to come to harmony. And indeed it's said that even the Buddha himself went to Kosambi and tried to intercede, tried to bring the Sangha back together. And it's said that even the Buddha was unable to do this, that the monastics brushed him off, basically told him it wasn't really his concern, that they would deal with it, kind of thing. But clearly they weren't dealing with it. And so what do you do in this situation? The monastics themselves can't come to an agreement. Even the head of the order, such as the Buddha was, can't make them come to an agreement. Well, it's said in this circumstance, eventually the lay followers of Kosambi neither greeted the monks of Kosambi nor stood up before them. They did not salute them with joined palms or perform the proper duties. They did not revere, respect, esteem, or honor them, and they did not give them the alms food when they came to them. Now, it's this last point that I think is the most important. That is, it's the lack of alms food, the decision by the laity not to provide alms food to the monastic that is the most important. Because, as many of us will know, the monastics in early Buddhism depended upon the laity for their food and for their clothing and lodging. In fact, they were, according to the monastic law, not allowed to feed themselves. They were not allowed to go out. They were not allowed to make their own food. They were not allowed to keep food, store food, not allowed to pick things from the fruits and so on. And this is the reason for these rules, the reason why the Buddha set these rules up in the first place, was indeed to keep close contact between monastics and laity, so that they didn't become too separated from each other over time. This allowed the monastics to teach the laity, but it also allowed the laity to, as it were, keep the monastics under a certain amount of vigilance. just for examples such as this with Kosambi. So the monastics at Kosambi would have been presented with a choice. Either they could cease to be monastics, essentially, they could feed themselves, in which case they were violating the rules, and basically they were giving up monastic orders, or they were going to starve. They were just going to starve to death. And presumably they began to see that neither of these was a good solution, and so eventually they were willing to come to some agreement. That's not entirely made clear what happened, but at least were taken to be understood that they eventually calmed down over a period of time. And this example, I think, highlights the kind of relatively uneasy, in fact, relation between monastics and laity within Buddhism. Usually it's an easy relation, but there is, at times of stress, this question, because in general the monastics see themselves as superior to the laity. They know the Dharma, and the laity does not. They're in a position of superiority ethically, because they're doing things such as giving up their family and giving up their wealth and relying solely on donations for their own food, so they're not being corrupted by the ordinary societies and so on. So they see themselves in a position of superiority, ethical superiority. But at times this can become reversed. And in the final analysis, it is the laity that has the real control. Because again, if the laity decides that the monastics are not behaving properly, if they believe that they have violated some ethical stricture, then they'll withhold food. And that really is, in the final analysis, what really makes the difference. We have to keep in mind, though, that all the cases I've discussed today are relatively minor cases involving, in the main, monastics who were difficult, who didn't want to leave the order or weren't behaving particularly well. But we might want to wonder what would happen in more serious cases, in cases of people who were not monastics, who may have come from outside to be true troublemakers or even violent or something like that. It's not clear from the early texts what's going to happen in that kind of situation. It's not discussed. However, we would have to assume that the monasteries would have relied on state power in that kind of circumstance, on the protection of the local kings, chieftains at the time of the Buddha, to deal with people who were real troublemakers, who were not simply monastics, to eject them or arrest them, deal with them some other way, which would almost certainly involve some kind of violence. However, it would be violence done by the state. It's not, again, it's left open, it's left unclear to what extent the Sangha is really on board with that. However, it's not clear how the Sangha would have survived without at least some aspect of state protection. These are matters that some scholars have discussed in passing, but I'm not aware of any detailed look at state power in the early days of the Sangha. That would be interesting to look at. I'm not sure that there's any real evidence about it within the Vinaya, because, among other things, the Vinaya, the teaching of the Buddha, the Dharma in general, is a teaching of pacifism. And so it's not likely to want to discuss these kinds of outlying cases. Now, what I would say is that the possibility of outside intervention in the part, let's say, of the state or police forces, we might say nowadays. Of course, there weren't police forces back in the day of the Buddha, but they are now. These are the kinds of things that you might say potentially violate pacifism. And again, this is something that really isn't discussed, but it would be good to think about, to consider, to put as part of our, let's say, ongoing practice, to consider how most wisely to make this kind of distinction or make this kind of balance, because we want to maintain the ethic of pacifism without it becoming an ethic of, let's say, passivism. That is to say, being passive in the face of assault, of true problems. And indeed, the Buddha clearly was opposed to being passive in the case of assault. Now, in the suttas, it's discussed, the cases that are discussed are, again, relatively minor ones. They're ones that involve monastics in arguments or, deep or angry arguments with each other, which amount to forms of assault in the Buddha's eyes or in the eyes of those around him. And I did an earlier video about that, on how we can be too passive or too equanimous in one way of thinking of equanimity in front of this kind of assault. And I'll put a link to that up on the screen. I'd suggest taking a look at it now. If you enjoy these videos, please check out my Patreon page. You might like what you see there. Join us. And may all of you be well.